Today we are reading Chapter 8 of the Candy Corn Contest by Patricia Riley Giff. Hold up your apples, one, Miss Rooney said the next day. Richard looked around. Emily Arrow had a big red apple in her hand. Wayne had a yellow one. Everyone was going to make applesauce. Everyone but Richard. He slid down in his seat. I don't see your apple, Miss Rooney said. I left it home, he said. Matthew turned around. He was holding a greenish apple. You can have half of mine, he said. Richard made a face. He didn't want to share Matthew's apple. Matthew's wet the bed apple. Richard reached into his pocket. He pulled out a rubber band. He wound it around his finger until the tip of his pinky turned purplish red. Then he remembered someone had said you could get blood poisoning that way. Maybe you could die. He took the rubber band off. Hey, Matthew said, do you want to share? No thanks, he told Matthew. I don't want your green apple. Matthew turned to the front of the room again. Richard could see that one of Matthew's ears stuck out farther than the other. Right now, both of Matthew's ears looked red. Dawn Bosco raised her hand. My mother gave me a box of raisins, too, she said, for the applesauce. That's nice, Miss Rooney said. That's terrible, Richard said. He felt a mean feeling inside. Miss Rooney put a big pot on her desk. I have some nice cold water in the pot, she said. We'll put the apples in, and the raisins, Dawn said. Yes, said Miss Rooney, and then we'll go. Down to the cafeteria. We'll put our applesauce on the stove to cook. Everyone rushed up to Miss Rooney's desk. Richard went up to the front, too. He leaned against the chalkboard. Now, said Miss Rooney, till I'll cut up the apples. Miss Rooney kept cutting and cutting. Richard sighed. He leaned on one foot and then on the other. It took a long time to make applesauce. Dawn Bosco kept saying, Can I put the raisins in now, can I? I hate raisins, Richard said, even though he loved them. At last, Miss Rooney cut the last apple. Dawn dumped in the raisins. Then the class lined up. They went downstairs to the cafeteria. Richard looked around. There were a skillion pieces of bread on the counter. The cafeteria lady was putting a little dab of butter on each one of them. She wiped her hands on her apron. She put the applesauce pot on the stove. Let us know when it's ready, Miss Rooney said. The class marched back to the room. Reading time, said Miss Rooney. Shoot, said Matthew. Richard and Emily and Alex and Matthew had to go to room 100. They were extra help readers. Don't worry, said Miss Rooney. Even if the applesauce is ready, we won't eat till you get back. Who cares? Richard said. What's the matter with you today? Matthew asked. Richard didn't answer him. He ran his finger over the bricks in the wall. Mrs. Parris was waiting. I heard your class was making applesauce, she said. Lucky. Unlucky, Richard said. It's probably full of germs. Do you think so? Emily asked. No, said Mrs. Parris, when it cooks. Matthew's germs, Richard said. When it cooks, Mrs. Parris said, the germs are boiled away. She frowned at Richard. Richard looked down at his almost baby reading book. Not Matthew's, he said. That's not nice, Alex said. You're not so nice either, Richard said. I bet you don't want to sleep near Matthew at my sleepover. Let's open our books, said Mrs. Parris. I'm reading a lot, Emily said. I'm trying to win the candy corn contest. Richard snorted. You'll never win. Mrs. Parris put her book down. What's the matter with everyone today? She asked. Richard took a quick look at Matthew. Matthew looked as if he were going to cry. It's good to tell the truth, Mrs. Parris began. That's what I say, Alex said. But Mrs. Parrish pushed her eyeglasses up on her nose. "It is not helpful to talk about people's problems." She looked around the table. "At least not in front of everyone." "That's right," said Emily. "When do you think you might talk about someone's problems?" Mrs. Parrish asked. "Never," said Emily. "Never," Matthew mumbled. "Well," said Richard, "maybe." Mrs. Parrish stared at him. "Maybe what?" "Maybe if you could help." "Yes," said Mrs. Parrish. "I don't need any help," said Emily. "Let's think of a problem," said Mrs. Parrish. "All right," said Alex. "I know one," Richard said quickly. "I forgot my apple." "That's a good problem," Emily said. Richard looked down at the table. Suddenly he remembered that Matthew had tried to help. "That was a problem," Mrs. Parrish said. "How could someone help Richard?" "Share," said Emily. "True," said Mrs. Parrish. "Not tell him he was terrible," said Emily. "True," said Mrs. Parrish again. She looked around at everyone. "When someone has a problem," she said, "help if you can, but not in front of other people." "And shut your mouth if you can't," said Emily. "Exactly," said Mrs. Parrish. Just then the door opened. It was Emily's friend Jill Simon. "Miss Rooney said the applesauce is ready," Jill said. Mrs. Parrish stood up. "Warm applesauce. Wonderful." She looked around the table. "All right, everyone, you may go back." Richard stood up. He didn't feel the mean feeling anymore. It was gone. He felt worse now. He had a terrible feeling inside. He knew Matthew was still crying a little. He wanted to cry, too. He wanted to tell Matthew he was sorry. He turned around to tell Matthew, but Mrs. Parrish was talking. "Will you erase the blackboard for me, Matthew?" she asked. "It will only take a minute." "Sure," Matthew said. Everyone else went back to the classroom. Miss Rooney gave out the applesauce, but Richard had a lump in his throat. He knew he'd never be able to swallow. "No, thank you," he told Miss Rooney. Matthew came in a minute later. He told Miss Rooney no thank you, too. Richard tore up his ex picture of Matthew. He was sorry he had ever drawn it. Come back next week. Bye.